Hello and welcome, everybody. We're here for Rory Stewart's talk on obstacles and opportunities to make aid agencies more effective. For those of you who don't know, Rory Stewart was the UK Secretary of State for International Development, overseeing a $20 billion a year aid budget. Before that, he was the Minister for the Environment, Minister of Justice, and Minister for Foreign Affairs. And before that, he was the Member of Parliament between 2010 and 2019. He established and ran the nonprofit Turquoise Mountain in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and he was a professor of human rights at Harvard University, worked in the UK Foreign Office in the Balkans, Iraq, and Indonesia. From 2002 to 2002, he walked for 6,000 miles entirely on foot across Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nepal. He was the president and is now the senior advisor for GiveDirectly, an organization that delivers cash transfers to people in extreme poverty, and is the host of the very well-known The Rest is Politics podcast. Rory's best-selling memoir, Politics on the Edge, was published in 2023, and Rory is currently the Brady Johnson Professor of the Practice and Grant Strategy at Yale's Jackson School of International Affairs. If you have any questions for Rory, you can submit them on the live interaction feature on Swapcart, and we will be monitoring those throughout the conversation. And so, yeah, without further ado, Rory Stewart. Maybe to start, so you were the Secretary of State for International Development. How much power did you have to actually influence where those dollars or pounds, I guess, are spent?
So thank you very much for coming. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yeah, thanks. So the odd thing about, and I think this may be relevant to the theme of what I'd like to try to talk about in the room, which is how we can bring the principles of effective altruism into these big government budgets. So just to sort of frame it, nearly $200 billion a year, $200,000 million a year are spent by international aid agencies. So the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, DFID, and the rest. A lot of money. And if we really want to tackle many of the fundamental problems in the world, from global health to extreme poverty, we need to change the way that that $200 billion is deployed. So, but part of the context of what I'm trying to say is this is a conversation about how you devote your own money, the types of project that you think are most effective, but also how you influence other forms of giving, because that's the way that we're really going to mobilize things. So, as the Secretary of State for International Development, I had entire control of that $20 billion a year budget. Now, these things change. At the time when I was running DFID, there was a commitment from the UK government to spend 0.7% of the gross national income on international development, so that 20 billion was guaranteed and in fact was due to rise. As GDP grew, that money rose. Furthermore, there was an International Development Act which stipulated that that money could only be used for addressing extreme poverty, and it could not be linked, for example, to Britain building a dam and putting its international development money into that. That meant that as a minister, I was very much insulated from politics, the treasury, day-to-day business. Right? I had, or my department and I had, entire discretion over where that money went. So I could decide, literally, and I remember making these decisions, a business case would be put on my desk asking me, would I want to put, and I think in one case it was over $100 million into a World Bank education project in Ethiopia? Would I want to put $27 million into a health program in Nigeria? Would I want to put $40 million into a water and sanitation program in Zambia? But, so to sort of answer your question, framing it like that, I hope you understand already how bizarre these decisions are. I mean, how do you actually know whether you want to put $100 million into education in Ethiopia or $100 million into education in Nigeria or health in Nigeria or water and sanitation in Nigeria? What sort of decision are you really making here? You really step back. How is that money allocated? Of the $20 billion, why this much in Ethiopia? Why that much in Nigeria? Why that much in Zimbabwe? And the first thing you realize is that there wasn't a simple mathematical formula. Right? It wasn't exactly that you were giving the same amount to every poor person everywhere in the world. It was a strange combination of, well, we think Ethiopia has some potential. We have a historical relationship with Tanzania. We're interested in Congo because the Democratic Republic of Congo has a lot of very poor people in it, but we don't work in the Central African Republic because we don't really understand the Central African Republic. We haven't really got an embassy there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the more you dug underneath the kind of bonnet of the car, the more arbitrary some of this decision and spending became. And the more bizarre the kind of decisions you're making are. I'm going to finish here, but just to illustrate the strangeness of it. My predecessor, Justine Greening, had said that any business case worth, I believe, I'm trying to remember, I think it was £5 million, worth more than £5 million. Might have been 10, but somewhere between 5 and 10 million pounds, needed to be signed off by a minister. But of course, the department is spending 20,000 million pounds a year. So that is an enormous number of business cases. And each one of these business cases is delivered onto your desk, often with 60, 70 pages worth of justification for this program. What's going on here? Does anyone actually believe that the individual minister, who is also a constituency member of Parliament 350 miles away, and having to vote in Parliament and speak in Parliament, and deal with a lot of other things in the department, is actually going to have the time to read 10 business cases, each of 65 pages, and come to a fully informed decision on whether the water and sanitation program in Zambia is valid or whether the education program in Ethiopia is valid? No. What's actually happening is the civil servants have a view on what they think should happen based on complicated conversations between them, and they want the minister to tick the box. And if the minister actually stops the program and challenges it, lots of problems happen. Lots of people come running. You know, why did you stop the program? What can we explain to you, minister? How can we? And often it turns out that the civil servants have effectively already promised the program. They've told local partners, they've told the World Bank, this is all going to be fine, and we're going to put the money in long before it arrives on the minister's desk. So if the minister actually blocks it, huge ramifications and trouble. So you're under immense pressure to actually sign off and approve almost everything you're presented.
So within that context, how much power do civil servants who are presenting these things actually have in terms of deciding what programs get approved?
Well, so my discovery on power is that power doesn't really reside anywhere. At most in the world, what we each have is influence. But it's impossible in these systems really to identify somebody who has the power. I mean, theoretically, the Secretary of State has the power. But in practice, if the Secretary of State does something that civil servants don't like, they will find it very difficult to do it. Right. Because there's a whole series of things checked. So what power do the civil servants have? Well, essentially, the civil servants, 98% of what the civil servants draft happens. So 98% of what's happening is done by civil servants. Now, which of the civil servants have the power? Well, there again, it gets a bit complicated. Is it the Director General sitting in London? Is it a centrally managed program? Is it the head of the local office? Does the head of the local office trust the more junior person in the local office who's writing the business case? Where are the budgetary allocations made? Who approves the country strategies? And then you're suddenly into a sort of incredibly messy map of 150 different people. This is one of the problems of trying to influence government policy. You start pulling at these threads, you know. I really want to make sure that they fund a, vaccination program in northwest Nigeria. there's lots of different strange things that have to happen in the system before you can guarantee that happens, yeah.
So how would you compare kind of trying to improve things? You know, you've worked for GiveDirectly, you've worked at a charity, and then you've kind of been in the government trying to improve, you know, international development from that standpoint. Do you have an opinion on, I don't know, if which is more effective, or, you know, where people might want to leverage, you know, their own careers in terms of if they're interested in these issues?
So I think I'm going to stand up for a second, if that's okay. If you don't
Of
mind,
course.
I apologize. Just to bring a bit of energy into my legs and maybe into the room. Listen, if there are people in the room who are interested in going into the field of international development, that is amazing, and I really would encourage it. But the key question that you need to ask yourself is not what field do you want to operate in, but what level of that field do you feel fulfilled within? What do I mean by that, right? It's not good enough to say to me that you want to work on infant child mortality or maternal child healthcare. Let's say maternal child healthcare, right? The question is, what does that mean, right? Because that could mean you want to be delivering babies in a remote community. That could mean that you want to be working for the World Bank in Washington writing policy on maternal child health care. It could mean that you want to be working for USAID handing out grants. It could mean that you want to be working for an international NGO managing that grants. It could mean you want to be working for a local government. You could be working for the Ghanaian government within their Department of Health. And the only way to answer that question is to understand yourself. Right? You need to know, are you somebody who likes policy? Are you somebody who likes grant making? Or are you somebody who likes delivering babies? Do you want to live in a village, or do you want to live in Washington, D.C.? And another way of framing it is this. Living in the village, you may find that you're making a 10% difference to 100 lives. Living in Washington, D.C., you may find you're making a 0.01% difference to 100 million lives. And I appreciate there will be many people in the room who think that this can simply be calculated, right? That you can simply run this through a computer, right? However, my experience was I found being the Secretary of State for International Development in charge of a $20 billion budget much, much less satisfying personally than running a $2 million budget working in a single city block in Kabul in Afghanistan. Why? Because in Kabul, I was tangibly, day in, day out, for 3 years, on the ground, seeing buildings going up, seeing a clinic being built, getting the water supply in, getting the electricity in, getting the sanitation in, building relationships, meeting people, getting to know people, and feeling and seeing day to day the transformation of a small area. Whereas when I'm in London, I might theoretically control $20 billion, but what am I actually doing? I'm sort of signing business cases. And $100 million into education in Ethiopia is a sort of unimaginable sum of money. I don't really know what that means. I'd much rather be the head teacher of an individual school than allocating $100 million to a whole series of schools that I never see. But that's me, right? The point I'm trying to make is that's me. That's nothing to do with you, right? Each one of you needs to work out who you are. Each one of you needs to work out what excites you. Does policy excite you? Does implementation excite you? Are you a practical person? Are you an intellectual person? Are you interested in politics? Are you interested in digging ditches? What is it that you like doing? Where do you want to live? How do you want to live? It's not the purpose or the goal, it's the living activity that you need to grapple with, I believe, in order to have a fulfilling life. Right, I'm going to sit down again.
So maybe going back to initially you spoke about how you would be given these different programs and deciding which ones you wanted to act on or fund. One of those was it GiveDirectly itself? Yeah, and you were not impressed by them initially. Can you explain why you were skeptical about cash transfers back then and what made you change your mind?
Yeah, so this is a very strange thing. I went on to be the president of GiveDirectly, and I am now a incredibly enthusiastic apostle for unconditional direct cash transfers. They blow my mind. I have never seen in my whole life, 30 years in international development, anything as astonishing, kind of almost miraculous in its impact, as giving people large lump sum unconditional cash transfers. I turn up in a village on the Rwanda-Burundi border where we're giving $900 per household. You return 3 months later, and the whole place is transformed. Electricity's doubled, livestock ownership's doubled, the roofs have been repaired, latrines have been dug, more kids are in school, nutrition's improved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, this is the big but, when I was the politician running DFID and people came to me and said, what we want to do is give cash to people, I said, you've got to be kidding. It's completely ridiculous, right? I believed it in a humanitarian context. I could see that maybe there was no point taking wheat from Idaho to South Sudan, and that maybe if you gave someone in South Sudan cash, they could support local markets and buy their own food, or decide they didn't want to buy food, they want to buy shelter. I could see that. But the idea of replacing international development with cash was deeply threatening. My first response was, what are we all doing? Right, we've got thousands of civil servants. We've all got master's degrees in international development. We're all meant to be experts in health or agricultural economics or whatever. And now you're saying we're just going to give cash to people. What's the point of all of us, right? So I think that's the first thing, that it's deeply threatening to what, if you were going to be pompous, you would call the producer interest. Deeply threatening to the institutions. Secondly, I had been brought up in a world that believed that international development could be summed up in the phrase, give someone a fish they eat for a day, teach them to fish they eat for a lifetime, right? And I thought giving cash is like the world's biggest fish giving program I've ever seen in my life, right? What we're supposed to be doing is capacity building. We're supposed to be going around transferring knowledge and information, and that's going to allow people to eat for a lifetime, right? And it took me a long time to break through that and realize what's wrong with that. And maybe we can get into that. It's very, very interesting because I think that continues to be a problem with people. It's actually a very silly phrase, that phrase about fish, for 3 different reasons. But we can get into why it's a silly phrase. But it was the one that really got into my head. And I guess finally, I was very worried about the politics of it. I mean, it seemed completely mad to me that I was going to be saying to a grandmother in Warrington, I'm going to take £20 a month from you in tax, and I'm literally going to just give £20 a month to some woman in Kenya. I mean, this is not what the grandmother in Warrington signed up for. Just taking £20 from you, I'm giving £20 to you. I mean, that's not what taxpayers' money is used for, I felt, right? I felt maybe voluntary people can do it, right? Maybe philanthropists might choose to do that, but I can't use tax, because tax is not voluntary, right? Tax is, the police will come and arrest you if you don't pay your tax. I'm going to forcibly remove your money and just transfer it to the other end of the world. Now, again, that was daft of me. What the civil servants should have said is, no, you don't get it. What you're effectively doing is taking £20 from the lady in Warrington and giving £200 to the woman in Rwanda, because the money is worth 10 times as much, right? Even 100 times as much. Maybe you're taking £20 and you're giving £2,000. That the £20 taken from the woman in Warrington, yes, of course, if somebody's on low income, that's a substantial sum of money, but it is the sum of money that could pay for a couple of meals. But that sum of money in the Rwanda-Burundi border, put together and well, let's not work with £20. Let's work with £900, right? £900 in Britain, very significant. But on the Rwanda-Burundi border, life-transforming. I mean, literally, it is your first shelter, your first access to eating more than once every 2 days, your first opportunity to get your kids into school, your first opportunity to access decent healthcare, your first opportunity to start a small business. I mean, it changes everything. But again, I couldn't see these things. and I was argumentative. And because I'm quite good at arguing, and because I was quite arrogant, I wasn't very good at listening to people who were pointing out that cash was a better way to go.
Do you remember what was like the moment that persuaded you or when your mind changed?
Only going to literally this village on the Rwanda-Burundi border is a real place.
And seeing it for
Yeah, it was only stepping out of the vehicle and suddenly thinking, whoa. I mean, firstly, this was a very, very, very poor place. So it began for me. This is another uncomfortable thing in modern philanthropy. For very good reasons, very, very good reasons, people do not want to show images of people in extreme poverty. There's an idea that it's bad because it's poverty porn, that it's degrading to people in extreme poverty to see their conditions. But for me at least, it's very difficult to really take on board what you're doing until you actually see what extreme poverty is like. So in this particular case, it was a woman who I think was probably 70 years old, living in a earth hut with an earth floor. Her only possession was a single tin cooking pot. There was nothing else. Not a mattress, not a plastic jug, not a glass, nothing. No cow, nothing. She had a daughter who was working in town as a maid, and the daughter was earning $9 a month. The daughter was sending, of that $9, $6 a month back to her mother. With that $6 a month, the mother was looking after 3 children. The 3 children who I saw were not in school. They were dirty because there was no water or soap for them to clean themselves. And the situation was absolutely desperate. This nonprofit, GiveDirectly, gave $900 to this woman. And the change in her life was incredible. So for me, I mean, literally, you return, there is a mattress. The roof has been repaired. The children are in school. They're clean. I mean, everything looked different. There was a cow outside. The whole village, when you returned 3 months later, smelled different because everybody had a cow. The whole thing smelt of cow manure. And what comes from that is suddenly everything's more fertile. There are more crops growing, etc. So for me, it was that. It's not that for everybody. But definitely for me, that was the moment where I was thinking, and I'll just sort of finish for a second. That village is part of a series of villages which have been studied in Gisigara in Rwanda. And on average, these villages have gone from 40%, just receiving this single lump sum cash, not a monthly payment, single lump sum cash, have gone from 40% electrification to about 70% electrification, 35% livestock ownership to about 80% livestock ownership, every roof repaired, everybody who didn't have a latrine has a latrine, everybody has government health insurance, school enrollment's gone up, nutrition's improved, health indicators have improved. Now, if you were to say, as DFID, as the Department for International Development, we want to go into this village of 100 houses, and we want to achieve all those things. We want to meet all those targets on electrification, health, housing, water, sanitation, education, etc. And you contracted a traditional NGO to do that. You would, I promise you, be spending something like $3 or $4 million to do that. Because they would be going in, they would be going needs assessments, door to door, they'd be bringing in engineers to survey the roofs, they'd be procuring the roofing materials, they'd be running education enrollment programs, they'd be running business training programs, they'd be running nutrition programs, etc., etc., etc. All these things were achieved not for $3 or $4 million, they were achieved for $90,000. It was the total sum money that arrived in that village. But it was very difficult for me to see this until I'd actually seen the result, because I think it is threatening and counterintuitive. Cash, there's something about cash which is a bit difficult to swallow. At least it was for me.
So now we have a question from the audience. What country's development aid or development agency are you currently impressed by? Are there any that show interest in your idea of using cash transfers as a benchmark?
Well, it's not very cheering. I mean, in every development agency in the world, there are some very good civil servants. There are very good economists. There are people who look at the evidence, and there are people who want to do cash. But generally, they won't do lump sum cash. Generally, what they want to do is social security, social welfare payments, monthly payments. And because they can't afford to do this for everybody in the world all the time, what they end up doing is giving a small amount of money per month to a limited number of people for a couple of years, and then they stop giving the money, basically. And we have very good evidence that doing that has much worse results than giving lump sum cash. And they will waste an enormous amount of money on monitoring and evaluation and paperwork and bureaucracy, which chews up a lot of the money that might otherwise be delivered. Why? Because fundamentally, these institutions are risk averse. They're worried about voters, they're worried about what citizens think. They find it very difficult to communicate. I'm literally giving $900 to this household, no strings attached, unconditional. They can do whatever they want with it. Whatever they want with it. And they don't know how to communicate that to a taxpayer.
Do you think it's tractable for EAs to advocate agencies to change their spending? What are the most tractable approaches?
And it's not just agencies. Remember, if you're talking about these bureaucracies, it's also the big foundations. You know, you also want to be thinking about foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation. I mean, these are organizations which give billions of dollars a year. So what would it take to change the way that they think? Well, evidence is part of it. And that is randomized controlled trials. So there have been more than 300 academic papers, and the academic papers are pretty convincing and compelling in the evidence they show that this is a very effective, efficient, tailored way of delivering development assistance. Secondly, trying to get people on the ground, reassuring them. Because one question, of course, that everybody asks is, well, wait a sec, if I give them $900, won't they just waste the money? And it's not until you're in the village and you see that this woman has spent 40 years in extreme poverty thinking, what would I do if I had a little bit of money? That you realize she's not going to waste the money, right? That you have to, I think, spend a little bit of time with people to get why she thinks this is a miracle, which gives me a chance to transform my life. It's not an opportunity to buy a copy of Hello magazine. It's an opportunity to fix my roof and get some food on the table, right? The third thing, though, is a much more uncomfortable thing, which is about human nature. Right, so at the end of this conference, all these people are coming up to me and saying, I've decided I don't want to give my money to GiveDirectly, I want to give my ideas, right? And I'm like, what are your ideas? I mean, you want to move to Malawi and manage our direct cash transfer program? I mean, what is your experience? You run a sandwich business at Heathrow and you've made a lot of money, but I mean, I don't get what, right? And that's why not every, but many, many wealthy philanthropists will say to you, I'm doing this really cool thing. You know, I've invented this amazing, famously, I've invented this amazing seesaw or a roundabout, which is also a pump, play pump, where the children can spin around and it's going to pump water. Or a very, 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 very famous international philanthropist who got out of bed one morning and decided that chickens had eggs. Chickens had eggs, and eggs have chickens. So what he was going to do is he was going to give a lot of chickens to people. And he was actually going around the world, like shipping chickens and saying to the president of Senegal, what you don't understand is these chickens are going to have eggs, and these eggs are going to have chickens, and then you're going to have more eggs and more chickens, right? And the president of Senegal is like, this is predominantly a rural farming community, right? We have chickens, right? We get it, right? And if we thought buying more chickens was the right thing to do with our money, we would buy more chickens. So much so that the president of the country actually literally sent back 300,000 chickens to the philanthropist. He was so affronted by the whole thing, right? But this point about vanity is absolutely central, because when you're showing off to your wealthy friend at dinner, and they're like, yeah, I've come up with this great new idea, which is, all about, turning child soldiers' Kalashnikovs into jewelry that I can sell on Fifth Avenue. What are you doing? And you're like, well, I give cash. They're like, you what? Like, well, I just give my cash to. Everyone thinks you're an idiot, right? Where's your brilliant idea? What's your unique contribution to the world, right? Because human vanity finds it very difficult to take on board the possibility that the thing maybe that you have that's most in demand is not your brilliance, but your cash.
Yeah. On that note, so you've been very all in on cash. Do you think there's any limits to its potential? Is there a point where you would scale up and be worried about inflation or anything like that?
Yeah, there are many limits to cash. There are no silver bullets in international development, right? I mean, I'm talking about increasing the amount of money that we spend in international development on cash to, let's say, at the moment we spend about 3% of international development money on cash. I'd like us to be spending 50 or 60%. I'm not talking about spending 100%, right? What are the problems with cash? Number one, potentially if you don't manage it well, you can have inflation impacts, although actually we've got better at that, and we're not finding that many inflation impacts, but it's definitely something worth taking seriously as you go to bigger scale. Right? As we go from working at a sub-district level to a national level, you have to think about inflation. Right? Second thing, unconditional individual cash transfer does not build public goods like highways, dams, electricity generation stations. And that needs to happen for development to happen. But that ought to be funded not by development grants, that ought to be funded by loans from the World Bank and from many governments around the world. I mean, this type of infrastructure investment, you ought to be able to borrow the money to do. Third thing cash doesn't do. Individual cash donations to a woman on the Rwanda-Burundi border does not sort out governance in the capital city of Burundi. Right? It doesn't work, it doesn't deal with corruption, doesn't deal with civil service procedures, doesn't deal with financial management. Sure. But that stuff, again, is not something that should be consuming huge amounts of money. Because fundamentally, working out how to tackle governance is not something that's about money, right? It's something about the commitment of that country to development and what you can do to create an enabling environment to address that. What else can cash not do? Well, if all you care about is one indicator, right? Let's say the only thing you care about is vaccinating children, then it is more efficient to put the money exclusively into vaccinating children. Because unconditional cash, by its nature, is multidimensional. The whole point of it is that every house does something different, because everybody's responding to their own needs and priorities. One person, their roof is leaking. The next person wants to start a small business. The next person, wants to buy a cow. The next person wants to get their kids into the school. The next person has an ill aunt. It's falling like water on a mountain landscape. It's filling all these valleys and hills. It's the most flexible thing in the world. It's tailored. But if you don't want tailored, if you want a one-size-fits-all, we want to do everything, the same thing for every house, right? And some of those things are good things, like vaccinating every house. Then you would put the money into a vaccination program, not into an unconditional cash transfer program. But if you want to address multidimensional poverty, right, if what you're interested in is not simply inoculation or extending life expectancy, but you actually want to give some of the poorest people in the world freedom, the great thing about cash is dignity. It gives them the choice. It puts them in the driving seat. It says they can determine what their priorities are. They know more about their own lives than we do. They care more about their own lives than they do. And they can do more for their own lives than we can.
So another question from the audience. If you were David Lammy or Lisa Nandy, assuming that they become the key ministers in charge of UK aid in the next 5 weeks, what would be your top 3 priorities for aid in the next Parliament?
I'd like to see the UK government go all in on cash. Cash, cash, cash. Those are my top 3 priorities.
How do you sell, obviously the UK has gone through a period of reducing its development aid in COVID times, and now we're still seeing that. How do you persuade the public of the importance of development aid, especially when you're a politician and accountable to them?
Well, obviously it's not easy. I mean, obviously, when people are feeling the impacts of a cost of living crisis, when they feel that the NHS is struggling, their schools are struggling, that public services are struggling, it is tough to say to people, we're going to take billions of pounds of your money and we're going to spend it outside the country. So how do you deal with that? Well, traditionally politicians deal with that by making arguments of self-interest. If we don't do this, these countries are going to become violent terrorist cells, or they're going to create a lot of poor people who are going to come as migrants to our country, or Ebola is going to break out in these countries and we're all going to get sick. So the idea is that it's in our own interest to do this. I don't really believe in those kinds of arguments because I think the public can sort of see through them. I think you have to, at some level, appeal to people's sense of altruism. You have to say, yes, it's very tough living in Britain, but it's much more tough living on the Rwanda-Burundi border. This person is eating once every 2 days. She's 70 years old, she's sleeping on the floor. This is what her kids look like. A small amount of money from you is going to transform her life. You have to, at some level. You can't just make the whole thing about self-interest because, listen, I mean, you can imagine what the response is. Well, why don't we just invest more in counter-terrorist operations at home? Why don't we just, if we don't want migrants, why don't we just shoot them in the water when they cross? I mean, there are lots of things you can do other than development aid if all you're trying to do is protect yourself. If you're really making the argument for development aid, you have to appeal to people's sense of moral obligation. And I think most people in Britain have that sense of moral obligation. You can see it in, you can see it when the Disaster Emergency Committee responds to a humanitarian crisis, how quick people are to provide money. They're not providing money if there's a famine or some horrible natural catastrophe somewhere else in the world because they have calculated that that is the most efficient way of protecting their own house. That they're providing that money because they actually care about trying to do something for people in misery.
So some people will say that, even if you do these small interventions at a smaller scale, giving people cash, it's not going to fix these bigger systemic issues. And I'm wondering, what role does randomista development play relative to other approaches like state building, which is also something you've been heavily involved in?
Well, I've done a lot of state building, or I've done a lot of what's called state building. I haven't succeeded in building any states, right? So I think that the great thing about unconditional cash is you can see the difference it makes in an individual life. But when I look at state building projects around the world, it's very difficult to see success. Look at Iraq, look at Afghanistan, look at Bosnia, look at Kosovo, look at Sierra Leone, look at Liberia. Look at the immense amount of money that's gone into state building in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I don't think foreigners coming in with a pot of money build other people's states. States get built. China's built a state. Japan's built a state. Rwanda's built a state. Ethiopia's built a state. But they didn't build a state because a bunch of consultants with clipboards came in and told them how to build a state. Right? I think 98% of state building is domestic, indigenous. I mean, and if you really want to do that, you can, as part of that, bring some consultants in. But the consultants are the icing on the cake. I mean, fundamentally, you need people who really want to drive the development of the country. And if they don't, and I saw this in Afghanistan, you know, I remember going to a room, actually almost exactly the size in the Serena Hotel, it was an anti-corruption seminar with a great, South African consultant who turned up, like many of these people, as far as I could see, in order to get away from his family, was spending kind of a year in Afghanistan. And in front of him was 250 of the most senior Afghan civil servants. And he was standing up and saying, you know, we're going to address corruption through transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes. And everyone's writing down transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes with their beautiful gold pens, looking at their Rolex watches. And the point is that fundamentally, the issue was not that they didn't understand the theory of transparent, accountable, and financial processes. The problem was they were corrupt. Right? And it didn't really matter what he said on his PowerPoint presentation. That wasn't going to shift that, right? So I'm very, very skeptical. And one of the great things about unconditional cash is it can operate in an environment where there is a strong state, but it can also operate in an environment where there is not a strong state. It can make a lot of difference to individual lives, even in places where you haven't succeeded in addressing issues of rule of law, corruption, civil society, etc.
Another question from the audience. You've changed your mind about GiveDirectly, but given that expert evaluators at GiveWell think that they can do 10 times more good by donating to their recommendations, why are you not promoting GiveWell? Do you disagree with some components of their analysis?
It's great. I'm going to come into this room to have a fight with GiveWell. I think that returns essentially to the point that I was making on what GiveWell is analyzing. I have a lot of admiration for GiveWell. I think they are a really net positive for the world. The work they do is extraordinary. But often, if you look at the particular initiatives that they are recommending, it will be based on the weighting that they give to infant mortality and life expectancy. So, for example, let's say, hypothetically, that they have found a non-profit operating in northern Nigeria where they are recommending that you give $70, which will be matched with, let's say, $70 from Gavi, making $140 for the inoculation of a child. Right? Let's now imagine my house in Rwanda, where we have 2 adults and 4 children. And let's multiply that $140 by those 6 people. Right? The question I would ask is, if I were to say to the inhabitants of that village, would you rather receive the cash, or would you rather that the money went to an NGO who vaccinated all of you? I think they would rather receive the cash. I actually think we could probably imagine a situation in which we gave the cash, unconditional cash transfer, in exchange for them agreeing to be vaccinated, right? So I could actually have a win-win here. I could have a much, much bigger benefit. But fundamentally, it's a very difficult choice. Put it in its most brutal, the way I see it, and maybe I'm oversimplifying this. What GiveWell is saying is that if you were to vaccinate everybody in that district, X fewer children would die, and people's lives would be extended by X number of years, on average. In this particular village, it might be, well, let's say in a group of 4 villages, it might be 1 child would live who would otherwise die. But for the same money, I could be transforming the water, the sanitation, the electrification, the livestock ownership, the business development, the savings, the incomes, the shelter of everybody in those things, and the child would die. Now, I don't know how you set about answering which of these things work well. I don't know how you come to terms with the question of what happens is if you are extending the life expectancy of people, but they remain in grinding poverty. They simply live another 2 or 3 years of absolutely miserable conditions, sleeping on a dirt floor with a leaking roof, with no livestock, barely able to feed their kids, but they don't get a disease. And the one thing that you cannot quantify is the question of dignity, the question of choice, the question that you are stepping back and not saying, this is good for you, this is what you ought to do, but here is the cash, you make the choice. You know more, you care more, you can do more, you make that choice, determine your own future.
So obviously over here we have a lot of, everyone here is interested in effective altruism, and a lot of times people are debating where to allocate their donations, where to put their time, investment, in careers. Where do you see international development relative to other issues like AI safety or animal suffering?
Well, again, to be controversial in this room, I do not believe that there is a fixed mathematical formula which can answer that question. I think you are comparing the incommensurable. I think the question of animal suffering, AI, future asteroid strikes, and somebody living in grinding poverty today on the Rwanda-Burundi border are very, very different types of issue. And I don't believe that you can build a single program that can tell you where you should go. I think at some level, there has to be an element of personality, interest, affection, connection. The question of whether you are particularly concerned about the suffering of animals or the suffering of a human, whether you're concerned about the suffering of humans in 300 years' time or the suffering of a human today. These are not things that I think... I had this with somebody, that many people in this room will be familiar with, which is Sam Bankman-Fried, right? I went to see his foundation head to try to pitch GiveDirectly. And I sat there and I said, I told my lovely story about all this wonderful stuff that was happening with unconditional cash and how moved I was. And after, I think, 12 minutes, the head of Sam Bankman-Fried's foundation said to me, yeah, well, I've got to go and get my lunch now, thanks. And I said, fine, great. Well, I hope you enjoy your lunch, but I hope we can continue the conversation. Maybe I could, maybe we could, catch up in a few weeks' time, and, I could... Because this really is quite an important subject, a kind of extreme poverty and 700 million people living in extreme poverty. And he said to me, frankly, I'm not that interested in poverty, and walked out the door. And I did not think, to be honest, here is this wonderful genius with a brain like a supercomputer capable of the most incredible mathematical calculations. I thought, what an arsehole.
Oh, that might be the perfect way to end this talk. Maybe now is the time to actually, I was told we could actually go to the audience and ask questions. Is that something we can do? Yep.
Yes, please stick your hand up.
Yep.
Yeah, a gentleman in the front row, just to get us going. Yeah. And somebody's coming with a mic. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Sorry to make you run. Thank you.
At the beginning, you were talking. Can you hear me? Yeah. At the beginning, you were talking about comparing the incomparable and sort of the arbitrariness of DFID spending. So I'd like to offer you a kind of a simple solution to this, which is that you try and compare the programs by the impact they have on people's happiness. So you can do this in well-being life years, or a method which even the Treasury has sort of signed up to a couple of years ago in the Green Book, but currently no one is doing it. And this gives you a way to look at different things, and it gives you a single point of comparison. And if you did this, you would cash transfer. So my organization have done this research. Cash transfers look really good. They're not necessarily the best thing, but they're certainly going to be right at the top there. And with the same approach of looking at well-being, you can look at aid spending, but also government policy as well. So what are we trying to do to improve people's lives? Here's a kind of a common way of doing it. And this seems like an interesting thing to do, particularly at a time of kind of constrained government spending. Where are we going to get more from our limited budget? So, measuring and increasing happiness.
I think that's right, but there's still a problem. And one of the problems is that I was thinking about this because we had a $27 million program in Ethiopia and a $27 million program in Nigeria. And they were identical programs. They were both about supporting rural health clinics with the same implementing partner. Turn up in Ethiopia, you see the clinic, there are fantastic patient records, there are doctors, there are nurses, there's a lot of community health workers, a lot of energy, a lot of patients being seen. Turn up in Nigeria, the clinic is basically empty, there are no sheets on the beds, there's human excrement on the floor, there's a fan, but there's no electricity, there are no patients anywhere near it. So what do you conclude from that? Do you put the money into Ethiopia because it's going to be more successful, it's going to make a lot of more people happier? Or do you put the money into Nigeria because Nigeria needs it more, and Ethiopia obviously is already going in the right direction, has a lot of momentum, whereas Nigeria is where the gap is, Nigeria is where the problem is. And I think that is an issue, because I think the happiness calculation would tend to put the money into programs that reinforce success, would tend to put money into the Ethiopias, and then I would worry about the Nigerias.
Hi, thank you for being here. One of the arguments in favour of doing more kind of traditional aid-based approaches is because some problems are better tackled on the population level rather than on the individual level, and would be excited to hear whether there's any particular population level interventions you personally would be more excited in and more keen to see happen. And secondly, if I may be cheeky, who do you think would win in a fight, you or Alistair?
Alistair would definitely win in a fight. I mean, he's 25 years older than me, and he would definitely crush me. Population level interventions. Well, I've talked about vaccination. I've talked about infrastructure, roads, dams, electricity, education. Although education is tough, very tough. I mean, I think these are all perfectly valid types of intervention, but the challenge is, how do you include the extreme poor in the story? I mean, the general pattern in international development, even amongst the successful countries, so let's take Rwanda. Rwanda's been growing at about 7-8% a year since 1997. Long period of growth. But the reality is 37% of people in Rwanda still live on under $2 a day. And the build-up of rural clinics is impressive, the build-out of road infrastructure is impressive, the electrification is impressive, the state building is impressive, governance is impressive. But the poor, the extreme poor, are not included in this story. And this is where I think the cash comes in, because the problem is that you build the road to the village, but they don't have the cash to get their business off the ground, so they can't get their goods onto a vehicle on that road and benefit from it to get to the market. You build the clinic, but they don't have the cash that allows them to actually take half a day off their work to visit the clinic or pay for their kids to go to it. You build the school, but in all these countries, actually, these schools are not actually free. They're theoretically free, but in practice, they're not free. And without the cash, the extreme poor simply don't put their children in that school. So I think it needs to be seen as symbiotic. And we need to understand that one of the problems is that we've put a huge amount of money into population-based interventions without addressing extreme poverty. And extreme poverty, and this is well, let's ask this room. Do you think there has been a significant increase in the number of people living in extreme poverty in Africa since 1980? B, a significant decrease. C, it stayed roughly the same. So 1980 to today. Right, so over this period of 45 years. Who thinks there's been a significant decrease in the number of people living in extreme poverty in Africa? Okay. Who thinks the numbers remained roughly the same? And who thinks there's been a significant increase? Okay. The number of people living in extreme poverty in Africa in 1980 was 170 million people. Today, it is 470 million people. And if I'm going to get cross for a moment, this is a room full of effective altruists. And 90% of you thought that the number of people in extreme poverty in Africa had either decreased or remained the same. The number has almost tripled. This is a massive, magnificent failure of the international development process, of the international development agencies and these foundations. And it drives me up the wall, drives me absolutely up the wall, not to attack you, but drives me absolutely up the wall that people like Bill Gates exist in a world of extreme denial. They're so excited about the progress they're making on global health, on vaccination, on life expectancy and infant mortality. They are absolutely ignoring the grinding, degrading reality of the way in which 470 million people are living. 300 million more than in 1980. 300 million more lives. And even in proportional terms, right? This is partly about population growth. Even in proportional terms, the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has barely declined since 1980 in sub-Saharan Africa. So the optimism of this movement needs to be challenged, says he, getting grumpy. There we go. Lady in front.
So you said that the next International Development Secretary should focus on transitioning to cash, but you have also told us a story about how the International Development Secretary cannot actually stop or necessarily control what programs need to happen based on promises that had already been made, etc. So, what can the next International Development Secretary practically do? What would you have them do?
Okay, so it's a good challenge. There is a lot more that can be done if you were really prepared to be brave through manifestos and through primary legislation. If you really wanted to pull a big, big lever, it could be done. But in practical terms, let's look at things that could be done immediately. One of them is that the Labour government has committed, like the Conservative government, to restore international development spending from a current 0.5% of GDP to 0.7% when the fiscal situation allows. We've had 3 fiscal events with headroom of 20, 30 billion pounds on each event, and no party has taken the advantage of actually restoring the spend to what is the legally obliged spend. Secondly, they should be working to insulate international development from the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office is much too involved in micromanaging the expenditure of the money on very, very unsuitable programming. Diplomats have many merits, but they don't really understand international development. They don't really have an incentive to understand international development. The money gets directed in bizarre areas. And then I think the thirdly is what you could do is you could say, okay, I'm not going to be able to make my whole spend cash, but I'll take, let's say, 5%, and I'll be bold with it, and I'll take risk with 5%. And I'll say, okay, let's try something that we haven't tried before, and that could be the unconditional cash, and use that as a way of building the argument. Sir, yeah.
Could you pick up the thread of fish versus teaching to fish, please?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm very, very grateful, so I'm going to stand up again. Yeah, so there are some very, very obvious problems with this, but it took me some time to understand them. The first thing is that you need to understand that often, we need to understand, I needed to understand that in many, many cases, what's holding people back is not their knowledge, but their absence of capital. One way that you see this is USAID funded benchmark comparisons between business training programs and unconditional cash, and between nutrition programs and unconditional cash, and found to their surprise that cash was outperforming the nutrition program on nutrition, and cash was outperforming the business training program on the number of businesses created. So the business training program studied 3 years later, they discovered, following the cohort in a randomized controlled trial, that it had had no impact on savings, investment, incomes, or the number of businesses and investment. The only change the business training program had done is make people more fluent in talking about business. The cash, on the other hand, had led to more businesses being created, bigger savings, bigger income, bigger investment. Again, the cash had led to better nutrition outcomes. Why is this? Almost certainly because what was holding people back with their businesses was not knowledge about how to write a business plan. What was holding them back is they didn't have the money to buy the cookies or buy the bicycle or buy the motorbike or get their stock or invest in some seed to get their fertilizer going, etc. And what was holding them back in terms of nutrition was not knowledge that they needed to put calcium in the diet of their children. They didn't have money to buy the cows, they didn't have any milk to give the kids, right? In other words, the problem is not that people need to be taught how to fish, in this case. They already know how to fish, they just don't have the money for a fishing hook. Right? Second problem with the phrase. The idea of teaching everyone to fish basically assumes that everybody wants to do the same thing, and that what you're doing is you're going into a village and you're delivering one program to the whole village. And international development works like that. It's all in very, very siloed. And I can see 2 people here. I'll take this lady and then this man. You can put your hand down, and I promise I'll come to you. Right? Very, very siloed. You know, this is money for health. This is money for education. This is money for water and sanitation. But the truth is that every single village house is at a different stage. One of them has a latrine. One of them is near a water pipe. One of them has some electricity. One of them half got a business off the ground. One of them has just had a calf born. One of them has one kid in school, the other kid not in school, right? So every single house wants to do something different. You know, you want to open a business, you want to get your kids to school, etc. In this case, then, you should not be going in there teaching people to fish, because many people don't want to fish. They want to open a bakery, right? It's the second problem with the thing. The third problem, which we don't understand, is that the money spent by somebody in a local community is far more efficiently spent than it would be by an outsider. If you come in with an international NGO in a shelter program or a water and sanitation program, an example from Zambia, we as DFID had a $40,000 per school program for water and sanitation. I am taken out to see it. I drive out as a minister in a fancy vehicle, line of vehicles. I arrive. I'm greeted by a group of UN agencies and quite a well-known NGO, and these happy engineers come out and they share their 65-page business plan, and they talk about all the engineering studies they've done and how they're going to deliver water and sanitation for women in the school, and that's going to allow girls during their monthly cycle to remain in school, and it will give them another 7 years of education. Wonderful, right? I then say, can I please see the project? And what they've done with the money is they have dug 2 holes in the ground with brick walls around them, and they have bought 5 red plastic buckets. Total cost, less than $2,000. Cost of project, $40,000. So I say to the engineers, why did you not just give $2,000 to the head teacher and let him get on with it? Answer, well, he might have stolen the money. My answer, we've stolen the money. You know, we have literally stolen $38,000 out of $40,000 through our consultation, our needs assessment, our logical frameworks, our monitoring and evaluation, our engineers, our land cruisers, our offices, all the studies that resulted in 5 red plastic buckets and 2 holes in the ground. In this case, the entire model of teaching people to fish doesn't take into account the costs of teaching them to fish as opposed to giving them the cash and letting them get on with it. And the same would be true with a house, right? If you go in and fix someone's house for it, by the time you've done your engineering studies, your health and safety tests, your procurement, it's a lot of money. Give someone the cash, they get their brother, their uncle to come in, they buy a metal sheet, they fix the window themselves, it's all done for a few $100s. It's a fraction of the cost that it will cost someone else. Thank you. Okay. Oh, thanks for the applause, right. Lady here, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate your authenticity and honest reflections. And I'm a big fan of cash, so I'll say that. But I also want to challenge you on the notion of cash being completely transformative. And I'm curious to hear your reflections on the amount of money that you give and what that can really do, right? Currently, I think you give something like 2/3 of an annual income, that would be. And treatment effects are around, I don't know, maybe 20%.
Often much more, actually. I mean, some of the recent programs are sort of $900,
It's more,
so it'll be more, yeah.
So when you think of the treatment effects that have been measured, though, in the studies, often it will get people from extreme poverty to either still in extreme poverty, but slightly less, or like really, really vulnerable. So what is it that makes you say it's transformative? And could you think of other interventions that are more transformative, or what does transformative even mean? And do you actually change the income and wealth distribution at all? Should it be a much larger amount? I'd love to hear some thoughts.
Well, I think this is a good challenge. So what does transformative mean? You're absolutely right. Giving somebody $900 does not make them wealthy. It takes them, if you're lucky, from being in extreme poverty to being poor. Right? In a really good situation, it takes you from sleeping on a dirt floor to sleeping on a mattress. It takes you from having a leaking mud roof to having a tin roof from which you might collect some water. It takes you from eating once every 2 days to maybe being able to eat twice a day. It might mean that you're more likely to have most of your children in school rather than otherwise. It might mean that you're able to access occasionally some basic health care. And it might mean that over time you can build up $150 of savings, maybe an income of another $100 a year. Might mean that you could have a cow that produces a bit of milk and has some calves. You're still a very, very, very poor person, right? You're still somebody living in a 1-2-room hut, sleeping in a mattress with a tin roof, a single cow, eating, if you're lucky, a couple of times a day with $100 in the bank. So if a flood comes along, an earthquake happens or a landslide happens, you're wiped out because you're just above that line. But in the world, there are currently approximately 3 billion people living on only $6 a day. So the assumption that moving somebody from $2 a day to $3 a day, $4 a day, like $6 a day, right, is moving somebody from that bottom 700 million towards the sort of middle of the world. It's not getting them anywhere like anyone in this room. Anywhere like anyone in this room. Is that worth doing? Yes, I think. Because I think those changes in someone's life are extraordinary. I mean, really extraordinary. And just having a mattress, having a bicycle, not sleeping under a leaking roof, having a cow, being able to have a bit of food is extraordinary. What could you do to do much more? Well, I think there you run up against the question of the amount of money in the world that we're giving, right? We're giving, let's say, $200 billion a year. And as anyone in the room would be able to work out, right? $200 billion a year would give $1,000 to 200 million people. And there are 700 million people living in the world on less than $2 a day. So we're making a calculation on meeting people's most basic needs. I mean, that $2.15 is just a definition of not being able to meet your most basic needs. And we're putting a huge priority on what it might mean to be able to meet your most basic needs. But my goodness, it's not producing a life of anything like the kinds of opportunities, possibilities, fulfillments that we would want for people. We're a very, very long way from a world of equality, and that's implicit in the fact there are 3 billion people living on less than $6 a day. Gentleman here had his hand up, and then we can move. Yeah.
Thank you for a very good Q&A, Rory. I wanted to focus on your emphasis on the dignity of those people that you're seeking to help, and implicitly, I think, the autonomy of them as well. I was curious if you might be able to speak to other types of interventions that might be similarly multidimensional in that way. One, which I think you've commented on before, citizen assemblies. I'm curious how you might see them helping the most vulnerable, either in terms of maybe population level decision-making for aid, or more broadly for policy-making around catastrophic risks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge believer in citizens' assemblies. I mean, I think the common theme, both with direct cash giving and a citizens' assembly, and people in the room, I think mostly will know, but a citizens' assembly is, instead of having people elected to a parliament, you use sortition. You randomly select a group of citizens like a jury, and that group of citizens then sit and deliberate over issues. Very, very successful, for example, in Ireland, as a way of dealing with the issue of abortion. I think would have been very successful in Britain as a way of dealing with a contentious issue like Brexit. What these things have in common is that they are radical actions of trust and respect. They're saying that a randomly selected group of people can be trusted to make a decision and make a decision well. And there are themes here of trust, of decentralization, of taking power away from the big woman or the big man in the center and letting people get on with it, about local people knowing more, caring more, being able to do more. So yes, I can see that connection strongly. Okay, we will take 2 last questions then. So lady at the back and, I don't know, I'm gonna give you the mean job of having to select one last person.
Okay, person in the back, in the red, purplish, yeah.
So I work at a non-profit which asks people to pledge to give 10% of their income to whichever charities they think will most effectively improve the lives of others. And we've seen charitable giving declining year on year. And I'm curious if you see a path for us to really revitalize generosity and charitable giving. And would you ever consider taking one of these giving pledges and maybe even promoting it?
The answer to that, I think, is yes. I think these giving pledges are hugely important. I think setting that is a realistic number that people should be able to meet. I'd love to support you on that, try to get you behind you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for this. I actually have to thank my one-on-one for bringing me to this, because I wasn't planning on going. But this is, by a margin, I would even say a big margin, the best talk I've ever seen. Like, I love that you challenge like the common held belief of EA that like the most cost-effective program is basically the most effective, and including my own assumptions. Like, the biggest part of my giving goes to the most cost-effective charity that GiveWell selects, and I'll reconsider this now. So, but one challenge to direct giving that I've seen in some studies is how much of an issue is it, the wealth disparity that you basically create between different communities. So if you give direct cash to one community, another community that might be just adjacent to that, that doesn't get these transfers, like this basically creates some issues. And how do you deal with that? How big of an issue is that? Thanks.
It is an issue. It is an issue. And paradoxically, it's more of an issue because the cash is so effective. You don't find communities jealous that the next door community received a capacity building program. Right? But they are very jealous the next door community has received cash because they want cash. They know that cash can change their lives. Right? And this is a problem in international development in general. I mean, in any development program anywhere in the world, nobody is covering everybody in the country equally. They're always selecting, where you're going to, let's say you were doing a health clinic, where you're going to put your health clinics. You're always avoiding things. We're now trying in Rwanda and Malawi to do full national programs. So we're trying to build up to a situation where we can say everybody in the country is going to receive this. That will, of course, then create a problem for the neighboring country, right? But I do think I would like to build to a situation where I could raise to say everybody in extreme poverty in the world could receive this money. But we're not there yet, and you're quite right. Until you're there, you're always going to be in a situation where one area that has not received it will look, and however much you say, we're coming to you soon, they're going to be like, when? Where's the money when you're arriving? That is a big problem, yeah. Thank you all very, very much indeed, and I'm going to hand back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rory.